Without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Cristian Solano Cordova, Boulder County District Attorney Michael Daugherty, and former Boulder County Sheriff Joe Pelly, and violinist Anthony Sabo. Thank you so much.
All right. This is called The Meaning of Courage. When I was my baby sister's age, I didn't have many worries. And it's funny because my baby sister, the Nayi, well, she's an American citizen, so things should be easier for her.
But it's not, especially right now, because the people she loves the most, my mom, our sister Beba, and I, are all undocumented. When we are threatened, she is threatened. My baby sister is forced to bear the burden of political attacks on immigrants.
I remember election night 2016. My mom and I were in complete shock, trying to absorb what had just happened to the country, trying to strategize about how to handle certain possibilities. I remember frantically Googling what happens to a U.S. citizen child if an undocumented parent is deported.
My dad died young, so I needed to assure myself that if my mom was deported, my sister Beba or I could get custody of the Nayi, who at the time was only 8. But then, of course, what would happen if Beba and I were both deported?
My mom and I totally lost track of time during our election night panic. So when hours later I came upstairs, I was surprised to find my baby sister, Denaya, wide awake, sitting in a corner by herself, crying, red-faced, with puffy eyes.
With my dad gone, I've always had to be the big brother, or rather the father figure, since my mom was always working. I helped Denaya with her homework, we read each other bedtime stories, played games. I tried to answer those unanswerable kinds of kid questions and comfort her when she was scared. But I'm not used to trying to comfort her when in reality, I needed so much comforting myself.
I remember tilting her chin, glistening with streams of tears toward me, looking into those deep brown eyes and trying my best to give her soothing answers to difficult questions, and just repeating,
"Don't cry. Baby, don't cry. It's going to be okay. I promise, it's going to be okay. Listen, why would you be deported? Do you even know what that word means? You shouldn't have to."
Listen to me. You are an American citizen. You will never be deported. You're right. I'm not a citizen, but I've got DACA. They can't deport me. I know Mom doesn't, but Mom is going to be okay. She's lived here for decades. She is not going anywhere. Baby, don't cry, please.
I promise. Whatever happens, we'll be together, always. I'll be there to put Band-Aids on your scraped knees.
I'll be there to help you with your school projects.
Yes, we're going to finish reading Harry Potter together.
And I'll be by your side when you need help applying for college.
I'll be there for you when you fall in love for the first time, when your heart is broken. I'll walk you down the aisle one day. It really doesn't matter where, as long as we're together.
And yes, of course, the puppy is coming with us if we go. Lulu is part of this family too, I'll have you know.
Yeah, that's the dimply smile I like to see. It's gonna be okay.
At least that's what I told her. I did my best to offer what I wanted to hear, what I wanted to believe for both her and our entire family.
Because how do you talk to a child about being taken from their parent or siblings without terrorizing them, without stripping them of their innocence?
Then, with each day of the first Trump administration, watching kids taken from their parents at the border, the increased deportations of parents like my mom, the attempts to end the DACA program that protects me and my sister Beba, the willingness to end rules that limit how long children can be detained, even threats to strip children like the Nayi of their citizenship. With all these mounting threats, it felt increasingly cruel for me to offer my baby sister what amounted to be a fairy tale, when in reality, she might need great strength to overcome great threats.
So today, I offer her and you another story. This story won't kiss it and make it better, but I'm hoping it will help us stay strong regardless of the challenges we might face.
I was 3 years old, and my sister Beba was just 1 when we crossed the border with my mom. We walked together with a group of people, about 10 to 15 people, across the desert.
We walked for hours and hours at night. I remember we were out in the middle of nowhere following some dim silver light in the distance. I imagined we followed it because it meant we were going the right way, some shining city on a hill.
We finally got to a road lined with street lamps. To avoid walking over the road that night and potentially being seen, we crossed through a drainage tunnel under the road. Mom had me walk through the tunnel in front of her as she crawled behind with my sister in her shawl.
Beba and I were wearing those little kids' light-up shoes that everyone was going crazy over that year. Mom had saved up a lot of money to buy them because we were going to be seeing our dad after a year of him being in the U.S. on his own, and she wanted us to look our best. The shoes were actually super helpful in the drainage tunnel to light the way for our mom and all the other people crawling through on their hands and their knees. But of course, in the dead of night, they were a dead giveaway.
We were finally able to see the moonlight at the end of the tunnel and catch a whiff of fresh air. But then the coyotes urgently requested that my mom take off my shoes. "There's a border patrol car parked outside," he whispered.
The drainage tunnel emptied out right next to a gas station where the border patrol car was parked. The officers were inside, we assumed. So we waited for a while, hoping they would return to their car and drive away. But no one was coming out, and for some reason, the coyotes grew impatient and abruptly told everyone to move.
In the chaos, everyone immediately scrambled, crawling behind tall grass on their hands and knees as the coyotes gave us voiceless commands, with their fingers on their lips and pointing to the ground. But the ground was covered in cactus thorns and pricklies, and I didn't have any shoes. While everybody else crawled, my mom stood up, carrying both Beba and me in her arms, and she just started walking.
And at first, I thought she was giving up because we'd surely be seen. I mean, everyone else was still crawling on the ground. But she stood up tall and walked with a defiant pep in her step, as if she belonged right there where she stood.
That's when I realized she hadn't given up. She just had faith that walking quite quickly and quietly was her best strategy to protect us. She was resolved that somehow, somewhere, we would be okay and that we would find a home where our family could thrive.
I have never forgotten the look on my mom's face as she walked out into the darkness, into an unknown country. That is when I first learned the real meaning of courage. It's not to pretend to be immune from fear, but rather to calmly and steadily take action in spite of it.
Now, some might caricature my little 3-year-old self as a diseased, toddler, criminal murderer, rapist, gang member in the making. And they have succeeded in scaring many good people who don't know any undocumented immigrants into thinking that a mother carrying her children to safety is nothing less than an invasion.
But Beba and I grew up, beloved by our friends and neighbors and strong members of our community. We both went to college.
I even became the student body president at MSU Denver. I'm not part of some invading army fighting against America, but like many of you, I'm fighting for the American ideals I know we can live up to.
Leaders in the new administration still want to take up my baby sister's right to citizenship, but I remain hopeful that my baby sister, maybe a young woman in our audience today, might one day be our future president and actually lead us to a future where we live up to those values to truly have liberty and justice for all of us.
But that reality is going to take a lot of hard work, and not just on my part or just on the part of the immigrant community, but hard work on your part too.
We each have courageous opportunities to treat others as we hope to be treated, and never just standing by idly when another's civil and human rights are threatened because your rights might be next. Even the smallest acts can have the biggest impact.
As Anne Frank once wrote in her famous diary, how wonderful it is that no one need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. Thank you.
Former Sheriff Pelly, Diodati, what impacted you when reading Christian's story? Simply as a human being, not in your professional or formal professional role, but simply as men.
I think the first time we did this in 2017 with the DACA kids was very impactful, but the world has changed so much since then. And the threat is so much more real, and the fear is so much more real and palpable, and I think that's what's changed the most since we did this the first time.
Thank you.
On a personal level, really struck by Christian's courage and what he was willing to put into this story, and then inviting Sheriff Pelly and me to be a part of reading it today. Also just for his family and everything they've had to go through. And I'll just share with you, I told my kids this morning what I was going to be doing here with all of you today. And my daughter said a question that really was difficult to answer, which was, are any immigrants actually going to be there? And I was like, I don't think so, because people are really scared, but some will be. And she's like, what happens if ICE shows up? And I don't have great answers for my kids right now. And for those that are actually impacted, the lack of those answers is terrifying. So I just really appreciate Christian inviting us to be a part of this today.
Christian, what impacted you co-reading your story today with these two readers?
You know, I think right after the election, I felt like I had lost so much faith in humanity, to be honest. But it's moments like these that really remind me that we're all human beings, and it's all about like talking to each other, right? And I think somewhere along the way, you know, we just started talking at each other rather than with each other, and somehow we're like the ones put into a corner every single time. But I still have faith in dialogue and in changing people's minds, right? Like 10 years ago, I never would have thought I would be sitting on a stage with two law enforcement leaders, sharing a personal story about my family. And also, you know, like 8 years ago, this model of co-readers started 8 years ago, and you know, I've been part of MOTUS as a monologuist for a long time, and now as staff, I really get to see the impact of this co-reading model. Not just, you know, that 2017 performance, which was really impactful and I think changed a lot of people's minds and policies, but you know, over the years, just so many people that we've been able to really connect on a really deep level. You can go and lobby 1,000 times at the Capitol and, you know, share a talking point, and that doesn't change hearts and minds the way that, like, sitting around a campfire and telling a story does. So I'm really glad that y'all accepted this invitation, and I'm really glad that y'all accepted this invitation. So thank y'all.
Just a couple more questions for y'all. What impacted you, or what are you reflecting upon after reading Christian's story from your professional capacity as DA and as a former sheriff?
So for me, gratitude that we live in a community and that I have the honor of serving in a community that stands for these values and is willing to stand up and fight for the rule of law and fight for immigrants in our community. I mean, you heard it. You heard about all the elected officials who are in the room. We have a candidate for city council. Jenny Robbins is here as well. I mean, it's not just the sheriff, it's not just the district attorney. This is a community effort. So I feel a lot of gratitude for everyone being here. And the first time that Christian and I co-read together was actually at the Capitol in March.
January.
Right. It's been a dynamic 7 or 8 months. So it was in January, and I remember the day very well. I knew it was cold. So the first time Christian and I co-read the story was in January, and we were actually invited to read this Christian story at a press conference announcing Senate Bill 276 to increase and improve immigrant protections for individuals living in Colorado. And the fact that you have people from Boulder standing at the front of that effort comes as no surprise because of who we are in this community, but it's also because of my friend and a great leader, Joe Pelly, who started a lot of this work in law enforcement and with the district attorney's office back in 2017. And it's more important now than ever. So as district attorney, I will always fight for justice and the rule of law, and that's why I'm running for Attorney General of Colorado.
So my 20 years in office was profoundly affected by one of the biggest pain in the neck people in the room, Bob Norris, who got me to his house and got me to sit down with DACA kids and hear their stories and understand them at a personal level. That impacted policies we made, legislation that we fought for. We made a lot of changes in sharing of information, use of our facilities for immigration purposes, all of those things. And they're still solid today, and Curtis is here, and he'll talk more about what's going on today. It's all under attack, of course. But proud of that legacy and proud of the history, the things we were able to accomplish, like testifying at the legislature for driver's licenses for all and shutting down information sharing, that kind of thing. So just a reflection and a very positive time and relationship building with a community that deserves that and deserves protection, which is what a sheriff or a police chief is supposed to do, is protect the community. Man, we can't do that when people are living in fear. When they're afraid to call because of their immigration status and report a crime or report being the victim of a domestic violence or a sexual assault, that doesn't do public safety any favors, any good. It doesn't build public safety. We're just destroying that. We're tearing that down right now. So.
An additional question that I have in regards to, so many of the things that were built up by the work of community, the work that you both personally have invested into, is when we are in these moments of attack, when everything that has been worked for by community is potentially going to be destroyed, how can community members essentially help raise up a different narrative so that what prevails is actually community work rather than what is being imposed upon us by the powers that be?
I've been retired a little over 2 years. All I've been doing is playing golf and traveling. In the meantime, I've been witnessing the erosion and the attack on policies and legislation that I fought for. And so to get a call to come back and be involved and to read a story and to talk to people about rights and that kind of thing was a call to me back to action and an opportunity to be involved. And I think everybody's got to be involved now. It's, it's nice to play golf and it's nice to travel, but right now we need to be involved and engaged.
The country is clearly going through an incredibly scary and challenging time, and the fight is on. And to me, we all have an obligation to stand up in our community and do whatever we can to help our immigrant community members. And we'll go through some of this with the Know Your Rights training, but it's after Trump was elected in November, one of the things we did in the DA's office, and Desiree Furley, who runs our community protection program, is here, was ramp up our immigrant protection outreach efforts. This program had been in place for years, but just doing Know Your Rights trainings all around the community as much as we possibly can, but also pushing back against the narrative that is being forced on a lot of Americans right now and helping raise up stories like Christians. So I'm so glad you're all here today to hear more about him, because I think when we have stories and give people accurate information, that's when we're able to stand up and fight and actually make progress.
Christian, anything you want to add before we transition to the DA's Know Your Rights training?
Well, I guess I want to add some context, because this story was written in 2018 when I worked at the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. And, a lot of the things, there's a section, right, like kids taken from their parents at the border, increased deportations of parents, the end of the DACA program or attempted end, trying to, end rules that would allow the government to indefinitely detain children, and threats to strip US-born kids of their citizenship. Those things were already ongoing in 2018, but those are the things that are in the headlines right now, right? And so I feel like we at least got to slow them down last time a little bit, but things are going into hyperdrive, and if this was written today, I think it would be a lot more intense. So I appreciate y'all being here today. And even if you aren't gonna personally benefit from a Know Your Rights training, I hope that you will really internalize it, because you might have a neighbor or a family member, or your kid might have a schoolmate who could use this knowledge. And earlier, I asked if anybody needed interpretation. There are no monolingual Spanish speakers here, and I think that is for a reason. People are scared. So I hope that, y'all could be rights ambassadors for the immigrants that you might know in your life. So thank y'all so much for being here today.
Thank you all so much for your reflections.
Thank you. We're going to bring down the screen and we're going to do a Know Your Rights training. And the original plan was that I would do the Know Your Rights training solo and then have some distinguished guests join us for a Q&A. But I actually think it'll be more effective and powerful if I invite the distinguished guest up here to be a part of the discussion and presentation, and we'll just kick around different topics and questions as we go through. So I'm going to invite up Boulder Police Department's Chief of Staff, Alistair McNiven, Mary Jo Highland, who's with the Meyer Law Firm, and she specializes in immigration issues and civil issues and immigration, and then Sheriff Curtis Johnson. So come on up, please. So I'm going to ask each one to do a brief introduction so you know who they are. But what I want to just say about the three of them and the work they do every day and their dedication to standing up and fighting for immigrants in our community and being here on a Saturday, to me, is no surprise, because I think the world of the Meyer Law Firm, Boulder Police Department's leadership, including Alistair and Sheriff Johnson, and what he's done in following up on Sheriff Pelly's amazing work at the Sheriff's Office. And when Kirsten was first putting this together with MOTUS, she asked me, do you think you can get members of law enforcement to come? I was like, definitely. She's like, you don't have any doubt. I'm like, no, there's no doubt. And it's not because of me, it's because of who they are and what they stand for every day. That's really unique to Boulder County. It's not this way in every jurisdiction in Colorado, so I just want to thank them for being here and for the work they do every day.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Curtis Johnson, Boulder County Sheriff. And in my third year of being sheriff in Boulder County, I had the honor of succeeding Joe Pelly and taking over a great organization and continuing to lead that organization forward. I do not get to play golf all the time, nor do I get to travel a lot. But someday I hope to be in that position. But it's an honor to be here, and I appreciate being invited.
Hi, I'm Mary Jo Highland, and while our law firm is in Denver, I'm actually a Boulder County resident. And my law career is because of Boulder County. I helped coordinate the sanctuary stay for Ingrid and Clara La Torre in the Unitarian Church. And my children were at New Vista High School while I was in law school.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alistair McNiven. I'm the Chief of Staff for Boulder PD. Here representing our agency. Chief Stephen Redfern would be here, except he had a conflict, so I'm a substitute for that. I also want to say it's an honor to have worked for all of my career, essentially, with Curtis Johnson, who often doesn't boast about this, but he was a longtime employee of the Boulder Police Department and a leader in our agency. And of course, had the honor of working with D.A. Doherty over the last few years. And we just met.
So we are going to jump into this presentation, and I'm going to go through the first slide or two, and then as we move further into the Know Your Rights training, one of the goals is to have you leave with some practical tips on what you can do to protect immigrants in the community and to spread the word about, but also hopefully with some feeling of hope. And recognizing that there are things we can all do in these scary, challenging times to stand up and fight for the rule of law and to fight for what's right and to fight for immigrants in our community. So as I go through this, I want to start by just emphasizing ICE is obviously playing a larger role in our country than they ever have. And in fact, they just received the largest infusion of funding of any federal law enforcement agency in the United States. So think about that for a minute when you think about the role of, for example, the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies. That huge infusion of funding that they're getting from taxpayer dollars is so that they can go out and conduct more immigration enforcement and arrest not just, as they say, criminals, but arrest individuals who are working in our restaurants, hotels, ranches, farms, in our communities, their families, their kids. That funding is also, in part, to build private prison facilities to house these individuals. And I just want to say at the outset of this presentation that private prisons should be outlawed. I was speaking to a group the other night in Denver about this, and they're actually forming a protest group to go down to one of the facilities that the federal government is now looking to take over for immigration purposes. So there's a lot of people engaging in these efforts. We're going to talk about the laws in Colorado, and by the end of this presentation, if you're not familiar with some of the laws we have in the state of Colorado, I think you'll recognize that we actually are, in a lot of ways, a really strong state for immigrants. But we don't have control over ICE and their activities entirely, so there's still legitimate fear and valid concerns out there. So we're going to talk about what organizations and people can do if ICE comes to the door, and what the legal protections are that we have in place. And we've also done, as part of our work, efforts to address gun violence and hate crimes, and I don't think we'll get there today. But when we do the Know Your Rights trainings in different settings, we sometimes include those. We're going to likely focus on just immigration today. So I'm going to start by just touching briefly on birthright citizenship. And what I will say about birthright citizenship is it is a constitutional right. And you see there, the first bullet point on the screen is an exact quote from the US Constitution. And in plain and simple language, it says that birthright citizenship confers to someone when their parents are in the United States and they're born in the United States. And if there was any doubt about that, the US Supreme Court addressed it in 1898 in this decision in which they reaffirmed that birthright citizenship is a constitutional right. So when I have people say to me in the community or on social media that birthright citizenship is not a constitutional right, I'll say, well, in 1898, which was quite a while ago, the US Supreme Court reaffirmed that it is clearly a constitutional right. And what I really want to stress is when you think about how many people have relied on that protection, that right, that interpretation, in building their families and their lives here, the announcement by the Trump administration on day one, when he was sworn into office, day one, the executive order to revoke birthright citizenship sent a shockwave through the immigrant community, not just in Colorado, but across the country, and for everyone, in terms of what it meant and the damage it was going to have. So the role of the Attorney General is really important in this regard. There are a number of attorneys general, including Phil Weiser for the state of Colorado, who filed lawsuits to block that executive order from going into effect. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of where we are. Yes, that deserves a round of applause, yes. So one of the lawsuits, for example, was filed and ended up in front of this judge. And what's important to know, and I have the quote on the screen, is he was appointed by Ronald Reagan 4 decades ago. And as you see in his quote, he explains that in his 40 years on the bench, he's never seen something as blatantly unconstitutional as this executive order. So he was one of several federal court judges who granted an injunction, a nationwide injunction. And then, as you may be aware, the US Supreme Court had a case presented to it in which the US Supreme Court determined that absent exceptional circumstances, one federal district court judge could not issue a nationwide injunction. So there's a lot of different arguments around injunctions, but what I want to just talk about is in terms of immigration. So the concern about that is then one individual judge or the 5 judges who had ruled on it up to that point no longer were imposing a nationwide injunction. But the US Supreme Court found there were 2 avenues that could still result in it being halted. One was through an attorney general bringing a lawsuit or through a class action suit. So 2 things actually happened in the last 10 days. One was in New Hampshire, a class action suit was certified, meaning they have enough people in the class action suit for it to move forward, and the judge agreed that there's a basis for it to move forward. And also a federal appeals court agreed that it appears that it's an unconstitutional act by the Trump administration to revoke birthright citizenship. So this question is still being litigated. It is going to be back in front of the US Supreme Court. Anything you want to add to that, Mary Jo?
The only thing I'll add is when we were watching the Supreme Court arguments about the nationwide injunctions, we do have a feeling that most of the justices will still side with birthright citizenship. Some of the questions they were asking were leading us to believe that they support birthright citizenship. As challenging as some of their recent decisions have been, I have some faith in this one.
So I'm very passionate about this issue, and it's in part based on my own background. So I'm the grandson of 4 Irish immigrants who came over on the boat with nothing but the shirts on their backs. I was recently saying that to my son, and he said, "Wait, no pants?" But in a lot of ways, their story embodies the American dream, because they come over from Ireland, they settle in Brooklyn, New York, which is where I was born, and they worked incredibly hard. And I stand before you less than 100 years later as the elected district attorney. And I'm really humbled and honored by that. And I wanted to just share this with you. This is a picture. My dad was a New York City public school teacher. He's on the left in that photo. And he had my grandpa come into the classroom to talk about being an immigrant. And you could see on the chalkboard in the back that they had other immigrants there for that day to talk about their immigrant experience in coming to the United States and coming here for the freedoms and opportunities that the country offered to them then, a path that is denied to so many people and made so much more difficult now. And to think that this picture was taken, and I've grown up with this picture hanging in my house, because this is something we are proud of and represented who we are as a country. And I wanted to include it in today's presentation because we're going to talk today about whether ICE has the legal authority to go into public schools to make an arrest. And the contrast between that and the reality that Christian and his family and others have to deal with all the time right now is why we're here. So we're going to start talking about some of the things that we've done, including immigrant protection. And what I want to do is just to get us oriented with a couple quick questions for all of you. And then I'm going to turn it over to Alistair and Curtis to address from a law enforcement perspective. Do you agree with me that if someone is sexually assaulted, they should be able to go to the hospital for treatment, call the police, come to the Justice Center so the offender could be held accountable without fear that they or their kids are going to be deported? Do you agree with me? Yes. Why is it that that is the policy and approach and now the law in Colorado from your perspective, Curtis?
Well, I think, we are fortunate to live and work in a community that has been very forward-thinking with regards to how we address immigrants in our community. A lot of things that are happening now are elevated, far different than they were even 6-7 years ago. But all of the policies that were put in place back then continue and are advancing. So there's a lot of information that we as law enforcement in Boulder County don't collect and don't care about. Immigration status, legal status in the country, none of that is relevant to the work that we do keeping our community safe. And so, for example, on a traffic stop, we don't ask. In fact, we have policies in place that require our employees not to ask. We don't enter that data anywhere because we don't collect it. At the jail, for example, we don't collect that data. And when I was running for office 4 years ago or so, people would ask, how many people in the jail are in this country without legal status? And the honest answer is, I don't know, because we don't collect the data. So we don't keep track of that information, and therefore we cannot share it. And so it's gotten very complicated in our criminal justice system because we're trying to walk a balance of keeping our community safe. We want people to report crimes for us, and we want to hold people accountable that commit crimes in our community. But at every step lately, we are getting challenged because people are afraid to communicate with local law enforcement, not fully understanding that we do not do immigration work. That is not our purview, and we have no interest in doing immigration work. All we want to do is keep Boulder County or the city of Boulder safe. Everyone in our community, regardless of where they're from, regardless if they're visiting or they live here. That is where our focus is right now. Al?
Yeah, I would agree. It's really tough to know that there are people who are hesitant to come forward, who are victims of any number of crimes. But when you, as the DA referenced, when you talk about someone who's a victim of sexual assault, the barriers they already may face at coming forward to interact with law enforcement are already high, and then you add on to that concerns that they have based on the events of not just the last 7 months, but going back to 2017. It's perfectly understandable why people might be concerned. So our hope, and the DA had alluded to this earlier, our hope was that you can be ambassadors to people to let them know it is not necessary for us to know your immigration status for us to perform police services for you and to provide all of the other services that complement police services.
Mary Jo, in your work in representing individuals who have immigration concerns, are you hearing this kind of concern from them, that they're worried about interacting with local and state law enforcement because of possible immigration consequences?
Oh, absolutely. And Boulder's unique. We have other departments and other agencies that are helping ICE. And so it's a valid concern in other communities. And I don't know if it's appropriate to necessarily call out where they are, but we've heard about them, right? And so we have people who are living very close to the detention center in Aurora who are terrified of Aurora Police Department assisting. We have people out on our western slope who are concerned with the Grand Junction Sheriff and the cooperation there. So residents in Boulder County are very, very lucky, but because it's confusing to know which city is going to report me, which city is not, that's a barrier to access to justice and access to safety.
Right. That's why these trainings, these presentations are so important, and we've talked about how immigrants who have concerns, understandably, may not come to a public place for these presentations. So we have another one scheduled Tuesday evening virtual. So we do these virtual as well, so people don't have to leave their homes to come attend these presentations. So we'll have information on the way out, and you can help spread the word about the virtual presentations. Another question, and I'm going to ask Alistair and Curtis on this one as well. If you have a case, and this is an actual case, where defendant is driving under the influence and kills a woman, a mother of a 13-year-old and 17-year-old, and the defendant is then picked up and deported 12 days later out of this country, what's the impact to you on the criminal case? But also, do you think that's consistent with public safety or a complete failure for public safety?
So I am familiar with this case because part of my responsibility is running the Boulder County Jail. And oftentimes that means transporting people, moving people from our jail to other facilities, getting them to court so they can be held accountable. And our community deserves justice when crimes are committed in our community, and we should have the opportunity to hold people accountable on cases like the one Michael described. But the challenge that we're facing now is individuals may get picked up by ICE and moved to the detention facility in Aurora, and we have a process, a judicial process, where we can go get them and bring them back to go to court and face prosecution. But ICE is no longer willing to honor those writs to allow us to bring people back. And part of that, what they have stated, is they are afraid that we won't return them. And because it's a judicial order, it's not a choice that we get to make. We can move somebody back to our facility to go to court, but a judge has ordered that you have to return them to where you got them from. There's still confusion and some lack of trust, rightfully so, it goes both ways with us and ICE, that we are not going to return people or that we will release them into the community without them being returned to ICE custody. And that is frustrating for us because in that case Michael mentioned, our transport people were ready to go pick somebody up and they were told, oh, too late, they're already on a plane. And that does nothing to help and support the victims in that case. It does nothing for our community to be able to hold people accountable in our community for the crimes they commit. So it's a really frustrating imbalance that we're facing right now and a lack of trust in both ways between ICE and local law enforcement. And as was alluded to, I don't think that relationship is the same across all county jails. They're looking at jails like ours who follow state law, who don't have 287G agreements or deputize our people to do immigration work, and they're calling us out for not cooperating with the federal government.
Yeah, what to add to that? I think I would just throw out, put yourself in the shoes of the families of these victims, and particularly in this case, and that was one of our cases. I see it both from that perspective and the perspective of the hard work put in by our detectives in bringing up a prosecutable case to the DA, just to have that disappear. No accountability. It's dreadful.
And the reason there's no accountability is the case cannot go forward without the defendant. So once he's deported, the case is immediately suspended. So having to meet with the family and say, we cannot go forward with the case. You will not have your day in court. We will not be able to secure justice. And I think where the public safety aspect is really important to know in the conversations you have with community members and family members who think ICE's action is consistent with public safety is highlighting that ICE deporting this individual back to the country from where he came, he's not going to prison in that country. He's free there with no criminal consequences for his conduct here. So you can't tell me that's public safety. That's a public safety failure when they do that, because we can't move forward with the charges here and make sure he's held accountable. And to the sheriff's point, ICE's decision about not honoring the writs is a decision that they've made also for Denver, Adams County, Arapahoe, and other counties throughout the metropolitan area in and around Denver. So One thing I want to highlight is since 2017, 2018, you've heard about Boulder County law enforcement not seeking information about someone's status in the country, and then when we learn it, which we often do in cases, because someone will share with us their background or their story or what concerns they have, we will never share that with the federal government. That's been our policy in Boulder County since 2017, 2018. It is now also state law. So under the law in the state of Colorado, law enforcement cannot communicate that information to ICE. They're not supposed to, and if they do, it's a violation of state law. And that's what Mary Jo was talking about earlier. Anything you want to add to that, Mary Jo?
We're just so lucky here in Colorado. We really are. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes and think that other states are doing the equivalent work, which they aren't. Even neighboring states. The driver's licenses that are lawful and available here in Colorado are risky in Wyoming now because Wyoming police is going to hold someone for ICE. So these protections, you have a list of them in your handouts. They are very strong, and we really appreciate all of law enforcement who honors them.
So courthouses, in 2019, there was a law passed in Colorado that individuals who are in or on the adjacent areas of courthouses, and adjacent areas is defined as driveways, parking lots, sidewalks, and so on, ICE is prohibited from making an arrest on an immigration detainer or civil immigration matter anywhere in the courthouse or around the courthouse. The logic there being that someone should be able to come to the courthouse to exercise their constitutional right, and also we want to see cases through to completion for the reasons we've already talked about. So ICE is prohibited from coming into the courthouse and taking any action within the courthouse. And in the moment, I'm going to ask the sheriff to talk about what the sheriff's staff at the courthouse is aware of in terms of the law and how this works in practice. We have not had this issue in Boulder County as yet. Other jurisdictions have. There are some sanctions that are available if ICE does violate the state law prohibiting them from taking this kind of action in the courthouse. So a couple things. First, the individual can bring a civil action for false imprisonment. I think it's hard for an individual who's been picked up on a ICE detainer or warrant to be able to do that, but that's an option under the state law. The chief judge can also issue a contempt order against the ICE agent or agents if they violate state law in coming into the courthouse or arresting someone in the adjacent areas. And the attorney general also, under the statute, can bring a lawsuit on behalf of the person or on behalf of the state against the ICE agent or agents or ICE itself. Anything you want to add to that about the Justice Center?
So the Sheriff's Office provides court security at the Justice Center and at the Longmont Courthouse. And all of our staff are well-trained and well-versed in the law in the state of Colorado and what state law says about what actions can be taken in the courthouse. And we have a system in place and a great working relationship with our new chief district judge, who is not afraid to make sure that we hold people accountable should they come to the courthouse to do immigration work. As the district attorney alluded to, we have not so far had this issue in our courthouses, and we're hopeful that we will not have this issue, but we are ready to raise the flag should that happen and take action, because we don't see that as beneficial for us or the individuals or the criminal justice system that action take place in or around the courthouse.
You're talking state courthouses, right? Because as soon as you walk out of a federal courthouse in Denver, ICE is picking up those people in the hallway and hauling them off.
So there is activity, yes, at the immigration courts primarily, which are federal courts. This is our local court where we prosecute, where the 20th Judicial District, we have 2 courthouses in Boulder County, one in Longmont, one at 6th and Canyon.
So when this law was passed, at the time, there was an executive order in place from the federal government that ICE would not go into schools, hospitals, child care facilities. So in 2019, when this law passed, it was specifically for courthouses. So when the Trump administration came in, they revoked that executive order protecting schools, hospitals, and child care facilities. And we'll talk a little bit about what the legislature in Colorado did in response to that. And Christian and I talked about how we were at the January press conference to kick off Senate Bill 276. Yes. But let's first talk about some of the things that we just want to make sure you have practical takeaways. So let's say you have a person who has immigration concerns and they're driving down the street and they roll through a stop sign, Boulder PD goes to pull them over, what would you want an immigrant to know and do in that situation?
Just to reiterate, we do not need to know your immigration status for us to conduct the interaction, or if a summons or citation is warranted, to issue that. And in fact, we go a step further. We have created a form for our primarily Spanish-speaking community that explains, particularly for simple traffic stops, the next steps that they have to take should they end up being issued a citation. And it's in Spanish, and we don't keep it. It goes with them. It just helps the non-Spanish speaking officer, if that's the person who pulls them over, helps them fill out the ticket. On the back of the form are a number of resources that they can take away with them, and that includes a QR code to access contact information for our Latina liaison officers there are 4 of them. They're bilingual and bicultural, and it's a mechanism by which people in our community can reach out to the police department if they want more information about the process. Likewise, there's also contact information for our courts. If you imagine you show up for court, whether it's municipal court or a state court, and you're a Spanish speaker, and there's no interpreter there, that's not great. So there's a contact number there to call ahead to ensure that you have the resources you need.
Thank you very much. And I should mention, our office actually hired an office interpreter about a year ago, Daniel Parente, who's here today with his wife, and I really appreciate Daniel coming in. So Sheriff, what are the points you want to emphasize for victims of domestic violence, witnesses to criminal conduct? What should they know in Boulder County when it comes to possible immigration concerns?
We don't care. I can't say it more simply than that. We want victims to come forward and be treated appropriately in our community. We want the opportunity to take care of them and provide the services that we are required to provide them under state law and under the Victim Rights Amendment. We want to take care of them and make sure that we can catch and prosecute their perpetrator. And, I think going back to what Alistair said, I will say the one most complicating part of the criminal justice system, that if people can avoid it, it is in their best interest, and that is the jail. Because I do not have complete control over data that has to leave the jail. Meaning the federal government has access to systems that we have to use where they can learn who is in jail, and they do the research on their end, not from anything we provide them, about who may or may not have legal status in this country. And so individuals that can stay away and out of the jail will be in a much better position in our community to be taken care of than if they get arrested and booked into the jail.
When it comes to jails and courthouses, it's important to take a step back and think about, we actually want those systems to be transparent, just generally. So for example, if my brother got arrested for driving under the influence, first, it would be a very bad day for the Doherty family. But second, I should be able to find out that he's in the jail and what the bond is and when he's going to be released. That information is required to be publicly available, and that's the sheriff's point, that when that information is publicly available, it means it's also available to immigration authorities. Same with the courthouse. If you walk into the courthouse, you could see every case that's on the docket for that particular day, which makes sense. If you're going down to see your brother's case, you want to know, where's the case going to be heard? What courtroom do I go to find out? So that's where people can be exposed to risk. And I want to highlight that the courthouses are also protected areas. So one thing with the Trump executive order that revoked the protections for schools, hospitals, child care facilities, that obviously had a very significant impact on people all across the country, including here in Colorado, because it means it's really difficult for them and very risky for them to take their kids for medical care, or take their kids to school, or take their kids to the emergency room. So in response, Colorado began working on Senate Bill 25276, which did a number of different things. And the first is something the sheriff and Alistair just touched on, which is local and state law enforcement should never be used for federal immigration purposes. And what would you say is the reason for that?
Well, the simple answer is not our job. We do not have the authority to enforce federal law unless we take additional steps to do that. But our commitment is to our community, not federal law, not immigration law.
So one of the things that changed was that under Senate Bill 276, a person cannot be subject to a civil arrest when they're in a related facility. And there's a long list of related facilities around health and treatment centers. And Mary Jo, what do you want to share about that? What's the logic behind that and that list?
Yeah, why don't I give you an example based on a conglomeration of some clients that I've had. So, and I'll just conglomerate them into one individual. So let's say there's an individual who had a traumatic brain injury and was unhoused for a period of his life and picked up some criminal cases due to being unhoused. That's a fairly common thing that happens sometimes. And also, due to being unhoused, didn't resolve those cases. They stayed open. And then was eventually the victim of a crime, was stabbed, and wasn't comfortable seeking medical treatment, and so doesn't have proof, really, of the stabbing, wasn't comfortable reporting it, wasn't comfortable receiving medical treatment. But being a victim of a stabbing does actually get you lawful status in this country if you can meet the requirements. And it's called a U visa. So I work with this individual about their U visa, and it's hard from an immigration standpoint to prove it now. There's no police report, there's no case, there's no medical documents, and the other thing is he has open cases, and in order for an affirmative immigration case, one of the things we want to prove is this discretion piece, that you deserve it. And I also don't want to put him on the radar with any open cases. So I say to him, you got to clean these up. You got to go in, you got to figure them out, you got to clean them up. So not in Boulder County. He goes in and turns himself in and has to spend, I believe, 2 days in jail to get everything arranged, get enough money based on the unhoused situation was challenging, was released into ICE's hands. What we were able to get the U visa filed before he was in detention, but U visas, once they're filed, take 10 to 15 years before there is a decision on them. This person, traumatic brain injury, stabbing victim, unhoused individual in our community, brought here when he was a child, but because of his life circumstances was lost DACA status, is now deported. So that's how these things pile up for individuals.
So under Senate Bill 276, there are more protections in place now for hospitals and child care facilities and education centers and schools. So you can see there on the screen, for example, ICE cannot go beyond a public area of the school, for example, a lobby, without a judicially approved warrant. And we'll talk about warrants as we go through this presentation, but what I would highlight for you very directly is that a warrant is something that should say warrant at the top and be signed by a judge at the bottom. It's not a detainer, it's not a request, it's not an email. A warrant should say warrant at the top and have the signature of a judge at the bottom. That's the only way ICE is able to get past the threshold of a school, for example, if they have a warrant. And we'll talk more about those protections in a minute. Senate Bill 276, which I strongly supported and testified in support of, also put in place the protections we already had in Boulder County, that law enforcement agencies and agencies working within the court system cannot share information with ICE absent a warrant from a judge. So that information cannot be shared with ICE. Also, individuals, and I'm going to turn to the sheriff in a minute, cannot be held at the jail past their release date. In other words, I'll ask the sheriff, if ICE calls you and says, we know someone's getting released on Wednesday, we can't come, can you hold them to Friday? What's the law require you to do?
Release them on Wednesday. And actually, state law is even stricter with release. If somebody posts bond or is set for release, we have 6 hours to process them out of our facility. And that clock starts as soon as their bond has been received. And there are times we struggle, depending on how court's gone that day, depending on how many bonds, to process people out. But we get everybody out in 6 hours, and we don't keep them a 7th hour, which means if ICE comes to pick them up, they don't know exactly when that person's getting out, but they're going to get out within that time frame. And we will not hold them on a detainer. We can only hold them in our custody if they have a warrant, an arrest warrant signed by a judge.
And I would suggest that that makes sense, right? We'll go back to my brother, who's never been in trouble, actually, but in this presentation, he's gotten a lot of difficult situations. If he's supposed to be released on Wednesday, and I go to the jail to pick him up, and they just say, we're too busy, we're going to hold him until tomorrow, that's completely outrageous and against the law. And that's what Senate Bill 276 codified into law, that it's actually an unconstitutional arrest, holding someone past that 6-hour window of time that a jail needs just to process someone. So that was an additional protection. Also around personal identifying information, there have been protections in place since 2021. Senate Bill 276 extended those protections, and I'll ask Mary Jo to jump in here in a minute, but extended those protections to other public institutions such as community colleges, childhood centers, and so on. What do you want to say about that from Senate Bill 276, Mary Jo?
Well, obviously we want people to take advantage of the resources in the community and be able to fully participate as members of the community. So that's why this is so important. And I think we're going to touch on it next, but the probation piece is huge too. Before this bill, a lot of probation officers would coordinate with ICE, and that was a challenge. Then we were having people not fulfilling their obligations under probation, because the lesser of the two evils from their perspective was not finish probation rather than get deported. And this piece of it's also very strong.
So why don't you address that now? How has that changed under Senate Bill 276?
Yeah, under 276, there's not that coordination anymore. So the public safety aspect of it is we have people completing their probation sentences. We have people finishing all the requirements of any sentences that they're getting without the fear of reporting to ICE.
Also, Senate Bill 276, and this final bullet point on the screen is important. Under a U.S. Supreme Court decision called the Padilla decision, it's years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court said anybody who pleads guilty has to be aware of the possible immigration consequences attached to their guilty plea at the time they decide to enter a plea. So judges go through a long list of questions when someone's entering a guilty plea. That list has to include, you may face possible immigration consequences. Have you talked to your attorney about that, or do you need more time? And the Padilla court found that if they failed to do that, if the judge had failed to do that, and the person had not been advised of immigration consequences, which we've seen in cases, then the person should be able to get their guilty plea back and be able to continue litigating the case so they don't have the conviction that triggers possible deportation. So that had already been in place for felonies and high-level misdemeanors in Colorado. Senate Bill 276, which just passed, now extends that to low-level misdemeanors, petty offenses, traffic cases, and also municipal cases as well. So if they were not informed of the immigration consequences, they are legally entitled to have their guilty plea back and continue litigating the case with that in mind. So one thing I want to highlight, and I'm going to ask the sheriff and Alistair to talk about the policies they have in place, is that all the public agencies and institutions we've talked about up to this point now have to tell their employees what employees are permitted to share with ICE and prohibited from sharing with ICE and under what circumstances. And they have to have written policies in place by September 1st of 2025. Where are Boulder PD and the Boulder County Sheriff's Office on that?
So we already had very clear policy in place regarding interactions with ICE. Old policy in our jail, J1618, I know it well. But we have already updated and reviewed it to make sure it is fully compliant with 276 and shared it with all of our employees to make sure that we are compliant with the law and following policy in our building. And we are fortunate to have a couple of great legal advisors that work with us who every quarter are doing legal updates to our staff to make sure as new laws that are passed slowly become law, we are teaching them so that there is no misunderstanding about what we can and cannot share.
What he said.
Okay. This is a picture that we're all too familiar with right now. And I just want to say very directly, ICE should not be wearing masks. I've had the honor of working with outstanding men and women in law enforcement for 28 years. I've been a prosecutor. Gang cases, homicide cases, really scary cases. And I've never seen the officers and detectives on those cases wearing masks. ICE doing this undermines the confidence and trust that people have in government, law enforcement, and the justice system, and it should be stopped. It's currently not a violation of the law, though. So one thing we wanted to talk about is what happens if ICE actually shows up. So we're going to move into the presentation, the part of the presentation where we talk about practical tips and lessons that you can take with you today. So you can ask ICE to pull their mask down and identify themselves. They're not required by law to do so. There are a number of legislatures that have, around the country, introduced legislation. There's a bill that's been introduced into Congress, and a number of the attorneys general have brought lawsuits against ICE demanding that they unmask, but it's currently not a violation of the law. You can film, if ICE is coming and making an enforcement action or making an arrest, you are permitted to film, but you cannot interfere. Why can't you interfere, Sheriff?
Same reason we don't want you interfering when we're doing our work. People get hurt and people cause confusion. You can film us, you can take video of us. Heck, we're all wearing cameras now in the state of Colorado. We're filming everything. But for the safety purpose, for public safety, for making sure nobody gets injured, stay out of the way, don't interfere.
And Alistair, is there a criminal offense if someone steps between Boulder Police Department, for example, we'll take it out of immigration for a minute. Boulder Police Department's going to make an arrest and someone stands between you and the person who's about to be arrested. Is there a criminal offense there?
Obstructing a peace officer, okay. Problematic. I actually have one other thing to add on that note of identification. We're in the process of putting together a video to be displayed on our website, and I'm not quite sure how else it will be presented to the public, but it's basically going to be a breakdown. How do you identify a municipal police officer or a county deputy? And it will show name tag, badge, agency patch, body camera, and radio. And also for each of the, most of the agencies within Boulder County, as well as our vehicles and what to look for and how to be somewhat confident that this is a legitimate law enforcement officer, because there is another way that you can do it, and that's call 911 or the non-emergency number and ask, who's this at my door?
So let's talk about that a little more, because I think that's a really important part. Let's say someone's being pulled over and they're not sure that the person pulling them over is a member of the Boulder Police Department. What would you recommend the person do? So
there's a couple of things. First of all, don't speed up. That's not great. Drive at a nice, safe speed. Put your hazard lights on. Drive to a populated area, the police department, and as long as you can do it hands-free and safe, call 911 and confirm, because you may be pulled over by an unmarked police or county sheriff's vehicle. So that's actually a good point.
So calling 911 is something that people can do just to say, I've been pulled over and I just want to know if it's really a police officer and what agency they're with.
Correct.
Okay. So another important thing is law enforcement is not permitted to take your phone without a warrant. So let's say you film law enforcement or ICE in an action and you're filming from a safe distance, you're not interfering, you're not obstructing. Law enforcement can't go over and say, we want that phone, we're going to take it. They have to have a warrant to take the phone from you. And I also think it's important to note that the safest way to secure the contents of your phone is with a passcode, as opposed to a picture or a face ID, I should say, or a fingerprint. So passcode. But making sure that you know what the law is. Can people film vehicles and license plates from a distance?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They're out in the public purview. Absolutely.
Agreed.
So what can business owners do? I think this is really some really important tips for folks here. One thing is posting what private areas there are within a business or a restaurant. So I had breakfast at the Walnut Cafe in South Boulder recently. That's my free plug for the Walnut Cafe in South Boulder. There's a lot of great breakfast places in Boulder, but I'm about to get totally sidetracked, so let me just stay. Between the seating area in the Walnut Cafe and the kitchen, I was really pleased to see a sign that said private, employees only. The impact of that is you cannot cross the threshold as a member of law enforcement or ICE without a judicially approved warrant. So that private sign is something that can have a real impact on individuals being able to access different parts of the business, or in this case, the restaurant. So knowing that there's actually legal implications there, I think a lot of us think about Know Your Rights trainings as being for immigrants, and they are, but it's also for us as community members and leaders and folks who own or work in businesses. Another thing to keep in mind is the right to remain silent. So when ICE shows up at a restaurant, for example, let's stay with the Walnut Cafe, ICE comes in and says to the waiter, "Is Joe working in the kitchen today?" The waiter does not have to answer that question. The waiter can and should say, "I'm not going to answer that question. You're going to have to talk to my boss." We all have a constitutional right to remain silent. So when ICE comes in, I think it's important that employees, especially if you have a young person working at a restaurant, that they're prepared in advance. So one thing we would stress is practicing it with employees, saying, if this happens here, here's how I want you to react. Instead of just assuming that in that stressful encounter that they're going to know exactly how to handle it, going over it with them in advance is an important part of it. And in a minute, I'm going to ask Mary Jo to talk more about this and the work they've done at their law firm, but it's also about making sure family members, community members, employees who face possible immigration consequences have prepared a family preparedness kit or a prep kit, much like we have in many of our homes for floods or fire. The scary reality is that for people who may face immigration consequences, and Bob Norris, you want to hold that up a little higher, Bob? Bob has a sample there, and you can get these from a number of different organizations, and the Maya Law Firm has them available, and our office has them too. But having it filled out in advance and giving it to someone you trust, or ideally to an attorney. The scary thing about the family prep kits for immigration consequences is the section that says what should happen with your children, and what should happen with your property, what should happen with your car. But this preparation is really key, because if someone's picked up by ICE, they're not gonna have the opportunity necessarily to make those decisions at that point. What do you want to highlight about that, Mary Jo?
Yeah, speaking of the family preparation, let's think of a scenario where a dad gets picked up and is put in detention and is the only person who has access to the bank account and to a lot of the financial information for the family. Now, how are we going to help them pay bond to get out basically on what the immigration bail would be? So talking through some of those things ahead of time, as scary as they can be, are really, really helpful for families. Having the plan, having somebody else in the family with just practical access, account access, things like that. Bob has a copy, we have a copy on our website. It's very much like a fire drill. I remember growing up, we would do the fire drill once a year. We'd talk about what our family plan was if the house caught on fire. It's a very similar scenario. What would happen if mom and dad didn't come pick me up at school? What would I know what to do? Does somebody in my life know what to do?
Thank you. And one thing I would highlight is immigration has obviously been an issue that we've seen each party struggle to get to a better place in terms of comprehensive immigration reform. So for years, we've seen immigrants being taken advantage of and victimized. So when we talk about what we can do as community members and business owners, one thing we can always talk about is paying immigrants a fair wage. So one thing I want to highlight quickly is in Colorado, we were successful in getting wage theft classified as a felony offense. And Bob Norris was a big part of that. And I forget how Joe Pelly described Bob earlier, but he was right, is what I'll say. And Bob got me involved in the fight on wage theft. And I'm so glad you did, Bob, because we were able to join together with other allies and get wage theft as a felony in the state of Colorado. And when I'm out in the community, and we're out in the community, and we're talking to immigrants, and I ask how many of you have suffered wage theft, usually more than half the room raises their hands, because people are taking advantage of them. We also fought for another improvement under the law, which is extortion. So extortion used to be limited to financial means and extorting someone for money. Now it includes language that we fought for and I testified in support of, that immigration consequences. So for example, I had a case years ago where 2 young women, sisters, were being sexually assaulted by someone, and he threatened to have them deported if they went to the police. In addition to the sex offenses, that would now be felony extortion under the law in Colorado, because we got the language changed to include immigration consequences. And it's a really important thing, because we see this in wage theft cases, we see this in domestic violence cases as a form of coercion and control. And I think Alistair and Curtis would agree, and I don't know if you want to add anything to that, that we've seen immigration consequences threatened as a part of trying to keep someone from going to law enforcement.
True, yes. And that is not an uncommon, especially with how terrifying things are right now for people. That's a really simple threat to make that people honestly feel could be followed through on.
Yeah, I think that last part of Curtis's point is critical. If you don't know, if you have this fear, quite reasonable fear circling around, and there's no one to tell you, you're going to be safe reporting to law enforcement. If there's no one there to tell you that, you're not going to go.
So these are some quick takeaways. Most of these we've covered already. I'll just highlight one thing that the sheriff alluded to as well, which is jails cannot enter into contracts. Jails cannot be used for immigration detention. They're prohibited by law in Colorado from doing that. They're also not permitted to engage in any civil immigration violation work that ICE is participating in. We talked about the courthouses. One thing I'm going to circle back to Mary Jo on in a second is around bond. But also at the jail, if ICE shows up at the jail, the individual has a legal right to be informed that they do not have to speak with the ICE agent. Is that right, Sheriff?
That is correct, and that's not new statute. That's been around for a little while, but it is clearly spelled out in our policy. Basically, in the statute, it says we have to go back and inform the person who's residing in our jail that ICE is here to speak with them. We have a list of items that we have to inform them of, including they don't have to talk to ICE if they don't want to. And if they say, I don't want to talk to them, we go back up to the front of the building and tell ICE they don't want to talk to you.
Joe Pelly helped bring that about in 2019, yes.
Yeah.
And then the last part is around bond, which is an interesting issue that Senate Bill 276 addressed, which is when someone has charges pending, they're being held in the jail, and a bond could be provided that will result in their release. If the person had been deported and then, as a result, was unable to appear for court, the bond would have been forfeited previously. But that was changed under Senate Bill 276. Mary Jo?
Yeah, and so instead of it being forfeited, it now goes back to the individual or the family.
Okay. We are so lucky to live and work here, but we're not immune from these challenges. And there are a lot of community members who are suffering right now. So our goal in doing this presentation, and in a minute we're going to answer some of your questions, was to provide you with some practical information and to let you know that there are people engaged in this fight. The only other thing I'd mention that we haven't touched on that you can do if you choose to is when you're deciding what nonprofits to contribute to this year or whether to contribute or not, what I would say is the nonprofits that are operating on behalf of and with immigrants are overwhelmed right now. Overwhelmed. So you could pick whichever one appeals to you. I'm not trying to plug them, but we have El Comité de Longmont up in Longmont, which is an incredible organization. Remain does great work. There are others if you want to jump in, but the point is these nonprofits could really use our support either as volunteers or financial. So that's the other thing I wanted to mention in terms of what each one of us can do. Anything you want to add to that, Mary Jo?
I was going to highlight El Comité. They do amazing work for Boulder County, and then always ACLU. That's who's fighting the big fight.
Okay. And CERC, yes. So there's a long list of these, but point being, and I'm glad you said CERC, so thank you, Margaret. just thinking about what we could do to support those nonprofits. Because right now, if you're going down to La Plata County, for example, they have a great organization down there, and you click on their website, and the first thing it says is, we will not be able to answer your calls because we are overwhelmed with calls right now. So send us an email and we'll try to get to you as soon as we can. So that's one other thing we could do. I know some of you had sent questions in advance. And Kirsten, I don't know how you want to present those, but we could start answering those.
Laws usually move at a glacial pace, but the actions that are coming and attacking the most vulnerable of our committees are happening now. And I feel like, to provide an extra analogy, if we end up just going with the way that things are and we like stand firm, the river is continuing to flow in a certain direction. And so I guess my question is like, that I'm trying to surmise is what is it that the police, the sheriff department, could be doing to actively fight against these attacks? What has been going on in California is like fire departments and even some police have actually chased ice out of certain sections. And I'm wondering, what is the possibility for something like that existing within the context of Boulder, within the context of Colorado?
Wow, that's really challenging. Thanks. So first of all, I'm not sure if people are aware President Trump had signed an executive order making it possible for law enforcement officers to be subject to both criminal and civil liability should they interfere with immigration processes. So you've got that. I think having good training for our officers, having them understand what their obligations are, both under state law and our policies, is our best bulwark against people doing things they shouldn't be doing. But it's a really tough question. And I wish I had a better answer than that, and maybe Curtis does.
Well, I think we are always trying to be forward-thinking in our community, and we have a history of operating in advance of the laws or doing more than what the law may just require, trying to exceed the expectations of our community by taking an extra step to keep our community safe. But you are absolutely right that the river is flowing, and I will give you an example from just this week. There are certainly people housed in the Boulder County Jail right now that have administrative or civil detainers from ICE on their file. This week, we got our first actual arrest warrant for an individual who had, according to ICE, illegally re-entered the country. We had not seen arrest warrants previously, but now ICE is upping their game, right? They understand how detainers and civil actions are being treated in Colorado, so they're taking the next step. And what do we do to move? That makes it more complicated for us because I can't ignore a judge's order. So how are they now using the system to their advantage to try to circumvent the protections we're putting in place? And it's going to just get more complicated.
Can I jump in with an answer too? I would love to see more coordination and networking between the different cities and counties in Colorado. We all know Boulder has a stereotype in Colorado. And you hear that, well, that's happening in Boulder. But can we not just model through behavior, but have those conversations with Aurora PD and with other DAs? This is why we're making these choices in Boulder. This is how it's keeping our community safe in Boulder. This is why we think this should be happening across Colorado. This is what the law says we have to do in Colorado. And it looks like you, as a sister agency, is not actually doing that.
And that's easier said than done. With 62 elected sheriffs in the state of Colorado and being part of a minority who are Democrats and who are trying to be progressive and support our community, there are counties that we work very closely with: Summit, Arapahoe, La Plata, counties whose values align with us, and we do communicate regularly about what we're doing, because I can always learn from my peers. But there are counties that have no interest in what we're doing in Boulder County. El Paso, Teller, for example.
I will say, though, to bring us back and to answer your part about it being a glacial pace for the law, the best way for us to address these issues is to have statewide approach that's consistent. So Senate Bill 276 being introduced when it was and passing as quickly as it did was really important, because you see when sheriffs are not complying with the law, them being held accountable. So when Mary Jo mentioned it earlier and you started to react, that's because Senate Bill 276 did get through as quickly as it did, and that's Colorado's response to some of what's happening at the federal level. Christian?
Yeah, I have a question that was submitted via email, and I think y'all touched on it a little bit around what people can do if there's an active situation with ICE. Y'all said not to intervene or interfere, but you can film. And I guess my question is, or the question that was submitted was, what should people be looking for when taking a video? Like, is there something that would help potentially, the person being detained in court, that, right? Like, if someone's rights is being violated, what kind of things should people be looking for if they're filming ICE activity?
Well, first, I'll answer and say no one is above the law. So if they see a crime being committed, taking that video and then providing it to local law enforcement would be what I'd want to see happen, because then it would allow us to act on it. But also to film it and make sure it's going back to whomever is connected to the person, whether it's family, attorney, advocate, so that they have it and have an understanding of what happened to the person and what were the circumstances around them being seized by ICE. Anything you want to add to that?
Something else we're working with ACLU on are collateral arrests, which means ICE is looking for person X and person Y and Z happen to be in the car with them or happen to be in the same place with them. Those are collateral arrests. That's not who ICE had a warrant for, if they had a warrant at all. And so if that is also caught on video, that may be able to help that investigation.
I have one other question that was submitted, and y'all also kind of touched on this. So I think the scenario was like, let's say, somebody shows up to, let's say, a church, and they get raided by ICE, or, well, we don't know. They're masked, unidentified, unmarked vehicles. It sounds like your agencies are notified ahead of time. No? Well, so then, should communities call the sheriff's department, the police department, and is there anything that y'all can do?
So we can't stop what the federal government wants to do, but we can certainly witness it and keep the peace. And to your point of what we know or don't know, for the most part, if ICE is doing something in our community, we don't know about it. They're not being overly communicative with us, especially in this community. And so, if there is fear, if there is a breach of the public safety, call 911, we will come. We cannot interfere with a federal, if they are lawfully doing their job, we can't get in the way of that. But we can certainly be a witness to it and make sure that nobody gets hurt.
What if they're doing it without a warrant? Isn't that therefore unlawful? So it's your duty to...
Could be, depending on how they enter. You don't have to have a warrant, because if I knock on your door and say, hey, can I come in and talk to you? And you say yes, that's consent. And I'm in the door. And so we would have to look at that very carefully.
So it's like vampires, just don't let them in. All right. We have some audience questions. So I saw you raise your hand, and then we'll go down this line.
My question in that scenario that Christian just put out to you, he said, wearing masks and unmarked cars. So if you are called, can you say, can you show me that you are federal
Absolutely.
agents?
And I think we will get an answer better than maybe a community member would.
Right, okay.
I took a training with the Colorado Rapid Response Network, which I think is really good because they're asking people to go out and witness these, be a confirmer, so that we actually can track actual events. And so I think that's a really good thing. But I wanted to clarify you said you were going to talk more about the warrant. And I want to clarify that warrants can be signed by a judge or magistrate.
Correct.
Okay. And then we've done some trainings with an immigration attorney in Know Your Rights in Weld County, in the Carbon Valley, Margaret and I. And we have to do those really in secret.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if the training that you're offering on Tuesday is really more for people who may need to know what their rights are. Because we would like to be able to refer them to like a Zoom training.
So I highly recommend the Zoom training on Tuesday then. Daniel's put together the PowerPoint in Spanish, and we'll have interpretation throughout, and it's virtual, and no one will be able to see who's in the Zoom room except for Daniel and me on our end. We've done this in a number of different times where we've done a Zoom training. I had someone who hosted an event at her house, and she had about 30 immigrants in the rooms at her house, and I was on the computer in my office. It was 8 o'clock at night doing the Zoom conversation because they didn't feel comfortable meeting in public. We've also done them in person at people's houses. We'll go wherever we can to meet people so we can have them not be exposed and not feel at risk. Just, we want to make sure they get the information more than anything.
Thank you. Thank you all for everything you're doing.
Sure.
I have a true or false. Anybody can answer. Let's say I am a DACA woman, young woman, working with some kind of approval to work in the United States. And I think it's true that if I marry a U.S. citizen male, it will be less likely that I will be deported. True or false?
Well, you know what the attorney's going to say. It depends. If this person with DACA came into the United States with permission when they came in, and now they're married to a U.S. citizen, then they can adjust their status. That's the attorney word for apply for a green card. So true in that scenario. If they are someone who was brought in as a child without permission, and they've only entered once, then they could still get a path to a green card, but that path would require that they exit the United States at least once in order to get the green card, either under a travel document, a pre-approved travel document, or with a waiver for having been in the United States without permission. This is the part of immigration law that I think is the hardest to talk about. If they were brought in once without permission and stayed for longer than a year, so let's give an example of somebody who came in at 3 years old, stayed until they were 5, and then grandma died. And so the family went and visited grandma and came back in. So this child was now brought in at 3 and brought in at 5. There's something called a permanent bar. That person, even if they marry a U.S. citizen, cannot get a green card unless they spend 10 years outside of the United States. There's no waiver for it. It's required. The 10 years are required. And then at the end of the 10 years, show proof that they stayed out the entire 10 years, and basically kiss the king's ring, shall we say, submit paperwork asking for permission now after 10 years to come back in. So that's why it depends. It depends on the other circumstances. But yes, sometimes marrying a U.S. citizen, given if it's a valid marriage for love and not for immigration, can lead to a green card.
Thank you very much.
So I know we have other questions. I have to, unfortunately, Kirsten just gave me the push because I have to go. But thank you so much for being here today. I promise you will continue to fight for me. Thank you.